Recognizing the member from Langley Willowbrook.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak on Bill 9, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Amendment Act 2026. Madam Speaker, there is one word that sits at the heart of the Canadian promise: freedom. Freedom is the word that draws people from every corner of the world to this country. It is a word that has defined generations of Canadians who believe that in this land, individuals could live openly, speak honestly, and take part in shaping their future. Freedom is not simple the absence of control. It is the presence of rights. It is the ability of citizens to ask questions without fear. It is the ability to take part in decisions that affect their communities, their families, and their livelihoods. Madam Speaker, but freedom cannot exist in darkness. Freedom requires knowledge. Freedom requires transparency. Freedom requires the ability of citizens to understand how power is exercised in their name. That is why access to information matters. When citizens can see how decisions are made, they are not simply observers of democracy. They are taking part in it. Freedom of information is, in many ways, the practical expression of that larger promise of freedom. Madam Speaker, it ensures that the citizens of this country are not kept in the dark about the decisions that shape their lives, because democracy works best when citizens are informed, engaged, and free to see the truth of how their government operates. And that is why the principle behind freedom of information must always be protected. At a first glance, this bill, Bill 9, Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Amendment Act 2026, appears procedural. It updates language. It introduces certain administrative authorities. It adjusts how the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act operates in practice. But laws concerning access to information is never solely technical. Madam Speaker, access to information laws define the relationship between citizens and their government. They determine whether people can understand how decisions affecting their lives are made. They determine whether public spending can be examined. And ultimately, they determine whether citizens can trust the institution that governed them. Freedom of information belongs to the people of British Columbia. It belongs to parents seeking answers about decisions affecting their children's education. It belongs to seniors trying to understand changes to health services. It belongs to small business owners seeking fairness in public procurement. It belongs to Indigenous communities reviewing decisions that affect land agreements and governance. It belongs to journalists, researchers, and citizens who want to know how the government operates. Freedom of information was never designed to make life easy for governments. It was designed to make democracy stronger. And that principle must guide our examination of Bill 9. Madam Speaker, the purpose of access to information laws. Access to information laws exist because democratic societies recognize that power must be accompanied by transparency. When governments exercise authority, they do so on behalf of citizens. That record created through those decisions belong to the public. Unless there is a legitimate reason for protection, access laws allow citizens to see how decisions are made. They allow journalists to investigate public spending. They allow people to perform and ministries to oversight. They allow communities to understand policies that affect their lives. Transparency protects democracy. It encourages responsible decision-making. It ensures that mistakes can be identified and corrected. It ensures that government remains accountable to the people they serve, and those people of British Columbia. When we amend regulations governing access to information, we must always ask whether those amendments strengthen transparency or weaken it. Let me illustrate what that means in practical terms, Madam Speaker. Imagine a community association trying to understand how a major transportation decision affecting their neighborhood was made. Residents may hear that studies were conducted, consultations occurred, and recommendations were provided to government. Without access to information laws, those residents would have no way of seeing the documents behind those decisions. They would be forced to rely only on summaries or public statements. Freedom of information allows them to review the studies, the briefing notes, and the recommendations that shape that decision, Madam Speaker. That ability to see the public record strengthens trust because citizens know decisions are not hidden from view. Transparency is not an inconvenience to democracy. It is a requirement of democracy. Madam Speaker, responding to the language in Bill 9, let me refer directly to the text of Bill 9. Bill 9 proposes amendments to provisions governing response timelines within the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Particularly, the bill replaces the obligation for the public bodies to respond to requests without delay with the phrase, without unreasonable delay. This change appears within the operational provisions governing access requests. At first glance, the change may appear subtle, but legislative language shapes the forecast. The phase without delay communicates urgency. It sets a clear objective that the public bodies should respond immediately to citizens requesting information. Replacing that phrase without unreasonable delay introduces explanation. It creates flexibility in defining what composes a timely response. You can add a simple everyday illustration like this so people in the chamber immediately understand the difference in language. Madam Speaker, precisely, Bill 9 replaces the obligation for the public body to respond to requests without delay with the phrase, without unreasonable delay. At a first glance, that may sound like a small change in wording, but words matter in regulation. Words matter in this House. Words matter because they shape the outcome. Let me offer a simple example that everyone in this chamber can relate to. Imagine you take your car to a local body shop for repairs. You ask the mechanic, when will the work be done? Just a very simple question. They should be able to tell you. And the shop's policy says the work will be completed without delay. You would reasonably expect the mechanic will begin the repair immediately, complete it as soon as possible, because it's supposed to be without delay. Now, imagine the policy instead says the repair can be completed without unreasonable delay. Suddenly, the belief changes. Your thoughts change. The repair might begin later. The timeline becomes flexible. The shop may determine that waiting several days is still reasonable because they're busy, because parts need to be ordered, or because other jobs are ahead of yours, because they're not working today. The words have changed, and with them, the prediction of urgency has changed. Or consider something even simpler. Imagine going to a restaurant where the menu says your meal will be delivered without delay. Most customers would assume their order will arrive quickly. But if the policy instead says your meal will arrive without unreasonable delay, the restaurant now has much wider room to decide what that means. 10 minutes may be reasonable. 30 minutes may be reasonable. Madam Speaker, even longer may be considered reasonable, depending on the circumstances. Madam Speaker, this may seem like a small shift in wording, but it illustrates a larger point. When this government replaces clear urgency with flexible definition, the balance suddenly shapes away from the citizens and towards the institution holding the information. And when it comes to transparency, clarity matters. Madam Speaker, no government should be afraid of clear timelines for transparency because accountability is not a burden of democracy. It is the proof that democracy is working. Clear timelines reform the idea that responding to citizens is a priority. Flexible language risks weakening that projections. And when urgency fades, transparency can gradually weaken as well. Madam Speaker, let me illustrate what this change could mean for an ordinary citizen. Before this change, a citizen submitting a request would know that the law required a response without delay. That wording set clear belief that the process would move quickly. The existing law says that they are supposed to get back to the applicant without delay. The amendment changed to that to without reasonable delay and makes the officials themselves the judge of what is and is not reasonable. For example, imagine a small business owner in Langley who submitted a request for records related to a provincial procurement decision. They wanted to understand why a contract had been awarded to another company and whether the scoring process had been applied fairly. Under the current projection of responding without delay, the public body would immediately begin process that request. There would be a clear understanding that the request should move forward as quickly as possible. But under the new wording of responding without unreasonable delay, the experience for that same business owner could become more complicated. The request might enter a longer review process. Officials might determine that additional internal consultation is required. They may determine that a longer processing time is reasonable given internal workloads. Instead of expecting a prompt response, the applicant may now face a longer period of uncertainty. For a business owner trying to understand procurement decisions that affects their livelihood, time matters. Madam Speaker, why timeline matters in practice. Imagine a parent in Langley whose child has lost access to a specialized educational support at school. That parent wants to understand how that decision was made. They file a Freedom of Information request seeking internal communication, briefing notes, and policy documents that lead to that change. Madam Speaker, before changes like those proposed in this bill, the prediction of responding without delay would push the request forward quickly. The parent would receive the information while the school year was still underway. Madam Speaker, the information could allow the parent to meet with administrators, advocate for their child, and take part in meaningful decision-making process. Now imagine the same request processed under a more flexible standard of responding without unreasonable delay. The request may move through longer internal reviews. The school year may continue. Weeks may pass. Months may pass. Eventually, the documents may arrive, but by then, the school year may be nearly finished. And that's why that matters. The parents may finally learn why the decision was made, but the opportunity to influence that decision may have already begun. Madam Speaker, that is why timelines matter. The importance of timelines and access to information cannot be overstated. Information often has value because of when it becomes available. Consider a small community requesting records related to environmental impacts of a proposed development project. Madam Speaker, if those records arrive after permits have already been issued and construction has already begun, the opportunity for meaningful public engagement may be lost, and that's why timelines matter. Consider a journalist requesting records about government spending on a major infrastructure project. If those records arrive after the public debate has passed, the opportunity for research demolishes. Consider a parent requesting records about change to educational services affecting their child. If those records arrive long after the decision has been implemented, their ability to advocate effectively may be limited. In each case, the information may eventually be released, but if it arrives too late, the right to know becomes less meaningful. Timely access is meaningful access. Delays are not simple administrative matters. They shape real outcomes for citizens of BC, Madam Speaker. Record creation and documentation, Madam Speaker. Another critical issue related to access to information is record creation. Freedom of information can only work if records exist. If important decisions are not documented, there is nothing for citizens to access. Modern government operates in an increasingly digital environment. Madam Speaker, communications occur through emails, messaging platforms, and various digital systems. These tools allow for rapid communication, but they also create challenge for record management. Important decisions may occur informally. Decisions may be made quickly, and unless those decisions are properly documented, the public record becomes incomplete. Madam Speaker, consider how record keeping itself can affect transparency. Imagine a community group requesting records about decisions that occurred before a major housing decision was announced. They want to know what options were considered. Madam Speaker, they want to understand which concerns were raised by officials and what advice was given to decision makers. In a system where record keeping is strong, those decisions would be documented. Briefing notes would exist. Emails and reports would show how the decision is evolved. The community group could review those records and understand the reasoning behind the policy. But imagine a different situation, Madam Speaker. Important conversations took place through those informal messaging systems. Meetings occurred where notes were not taken. Key decisions were never informally documented. When the Freedom of Information request is submitted, the ministry responds that few records exist. That the decision may have involved months of discussion, but the official record appears thin. The citizens asking questions are left with only fragments of the story. This is why record creation matters. Transparency depends not only on access laws, but also on the quality of the public record itself. Madam Speaker, transparency begins long before a request for information is submitted. Transparency begins when decisions are recorded, when documentation practices are strong. Access requests become easier to fulfill. When records are incomplete or poorly organized, delays become unpreventable. Improving record creation practice would strengthen transparency remarkably. Madam Speaker, clear records protect citizens, but they also protect institutions. They ensure the future governments, researchers, and recorders can understand how decisions were actually made. Madam Speaker, administrative consistency across institutions matter. Madam Speaker, another issue worth examining is consistency across public institutions. Most public bodies in British Columbia are subject to Freedom of Information obligations. 1. Ministries must respond to requests. 2. Health authorities must respond. 3. School boards must respond. And 4. Various public agencies must respond. Madam Speaker, let me offer one final example that speaks to consistency across institutions. Imagine a citizen trying to understand how public funds were spent on a government initiative. They may submit a Freedom of Information request to a ministry responsible for delivering the program. The ministry must respond because it is subject to the Act. but the citizen may also wish to understand how administrative decisions related to how the program was organized within other parts of the government. If transparency standards differ between institutions, the citizen may receive detailed records from one public body but be unable to access similar information from another. This bill is unclear how this would operate seamlessly. Madam Speaker, to the citizens, the difference between those institutions may not be clear. From their point of view, they are simply asking how public money was used. When transparency standards appear uneven, it can create confusion. Consistency across public institutions help ensure that citizens can follow the public record wherever decisions are made. Transparency should not depend on where inside government a decision happens. It should follow the public interest. Madam Speaker, these obligations exist because these institutions exercise public authority and manage public resources. Citizens expect transparency standards to apply consistency across the public sector. This raises another important question about administrative functions within this ministry. This decision is not about debate in this chamber. Parliamentary privilege protects legislative speech. However, the administrative matters such as procurement, operational spending, and internal policies are similar to administrative functions carried out by other public bodies. When transparency standards vary between institutions performing similar administrative roles, it can create the understanding that openness is applied unevenly. Consistency strengthens trust. If transparency strengthens accountability in ministries, it strengthens the accountability in institutional administrations as well. Madam Speaker, transparency as a democratic principle at its core. This debate concerns a simple democratic principle that this government fails to model. Information held by government does not belong to the government. It belongs to the public. And quite honestly, I think this government has forgotten this. Government institutions hold information in trust on behalf of citizens, on behalf of British Columbians. Citizens rely on transparency to understand policy. They rely on access to information to evaluate government actions. They rely on public records to take part in meaningfulness in democratic debate. Freedom of information was never designed to make life easy for government. It was designed to make democracy stronger. Governments change. Political parties move between government and opposition, but democratic institutions endure. Strong access to laws protect those institutions regardless of who's in power. Madam Speaker, a forward-looking vision for modernization. Modernization can strengthen transparency if it is approached thoughtfully. Digital tools can improve record management. Madam Speaker, governments can proactively publish regularly requested information. Public reporting systems can provide clear insight into response times. I believe modernization could include several improvements. 1, it can clear service benchmarks for responding to access requests. 2, public dashboards reporting response times and backlog levels. 3, a proactive publication of commonly requested documents. 4, an improved digital system for managing records. And 5, training programs to support public servants responsible for processing requests. These improvements would strengthen transparency while improving effectiveness. Modernization should expand access rather than narrow it. Madam Speaker, trust and public confidence comes down to a very simple principle that hint at this bill. Public trust is one of the most valuable assets a government controls. Transparency helps maintain that trust. When citizens can see how decisions are made, they are more likely to accept those decisions, even when they disagree with them. But when transparency appears to weaken, suspicions start to grow. Democracy works best in the light. The moment government begins to dim that light, even slightly, public trust begins to fade. Maintaining transparency requires laws that reinforce openness. Access to information regulation is one of the key tools that protect the openness. Madam Speaker, in closing, Bill 9 may appear technical, but the principles behind access to information regulations are anything but technical. What is at stake here is not administrative language. What is at stake is whether this government is prepared to defend transparency or quietly dilute it. This debate is about whether citizens can see how decisions are made in their name. It is about whether the public can follow the paper trail behind billions of dollars in government spending. It is about whether transparency will remain a cornerstone of governance in British Columbia, or whether it will slowly be replaced with language that gives government more control and the public less certainty and access. Madam Speaker, instead of improving transparency, the government is rewriting the rules around how and when the public can access information. British Columbians deserve a government that is open and accountable, not one that controls what information the public can see. Madam Speaker, freedom of information is not an inconvenience for government. It is not a bureaucratic hurdle to be managed. It is a safeguard that protects the public from secrecy. And yet, with Bill 9, this government is asking that Bill 9 to accept softer language, broader options, and clear projections for how quickly citizens can access the information that belongs to them, that belongs to British Columbians. Madam Speaker, that should concern every member of this House. Freedom of information reminds governments of something very important. Authority is temporary. Governments come and go. Parties rise and fall, but the public record lasts. Transparency is what allows citizens, journalists, researchers, and future governments to understand how decisions were made and to hold those decisions up to audit. Strong access laws strengthen institutions because they ensure that government operates in the light. Weakening those laws does the opposite. It invites suspiciousness, it erodes trust, and it sends the message that transparency is optional rather than essential. So as we consider the amendments contained in Bill 9, the question before this House and this chamber is simple. Are we strengthening transparency for the people of British Columbia, or are we weakening it for the convenience of government? Because transparency does more than release documents. Madam Speaker, freedom of information only works if government can decide which requests they will answer. The bill's proposed changes to BC's FOI laws risk making is harder, slower, and more expensive for British Columbians to access information about this government. Transparency protects democracy itself. Thank you, Madam Speaker.